Because we owe it to those people outside this chamber. We owe it first and foremost to the patients who were, in some instances, killed in our hospitals. We owe it to their grieving families, for whom no amount of politicians saying lessons have been learnt can bring back their mum, their dad, their sister, their brother, their child, their friend. But after nurses and their families, and doctors and their families, and patients and their families, we really do owe it to those dedicated doctors and nurses who are struggling to raise the alarm against a system which systematically suppressed their concerns. Many of whom retired early in protest to what they were being asked to do, some of whom tried whistleblowing and were not met with thanks from the authorities, but intimidation and gagging. We'll hear about some of that further. So I must congratulate the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health in their appointment of Don Berwick to ensure the basic requirement of do no harm is embedded in healthcare. Don Berwick, an advisor to President Obama, is an internationally renowned authority on healthcare. And the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, which he co-founded and chaired for 21 years, is a world-leading centre of medical improvements based on proven success. So I'm delighted the Prime Minister has put Don Berwick right at the heart of improving our healthcare system. Yeah. But the tragedy is that the wisdom and the recommendations of Don Berwick are not new. They've been delivered before. They were delivered to a different government, the last government, in no uncertain terms, back in 2008, when David Nicholson was Chief Executive of the NHS. But instead of implementing these recommendations urgently, the last government was uncomfortable about the facts that this report revealed about their NHS, so they decided to suppress these truths. They suppressed a report by Don Berwick and his Institute of Healthcare Improvement, along with two other damning reports which contained international experts, RAND and the Joint Commission International, which contained burning recommendations to be implemented with all urgency. I will give way.
Well, far from suppressed, Mr. Speaker, about these reports, if the Honourable Lady would turn to page 1281 of Volume 2 of the Francis report, Francis indeed saw every one of these reports. He says, as part of his work, leading the working group, Sir Liam Donaldson, the Chief Medical Officer, commissioned reports from 3 highly respected US-based organisations. He goes on to say, and to conclude in that paragraph, indeed, it is clear that the next stage review, the Darcy review, sought to address many of the concerns raised in these reports.
Sorry, I think we've got something to say.
No.
Oh, thank goodness for that. What I would say is that we do need short, concise interventions, because obviously a lot of members do wish to speak, and I don't want to reduce the time more, but that's what will happen if we're not careful. Charlotte Lane.
I congratulate the Honourable Member on seeking to defend his government's record, and I will address his point very fully later on in my speech. Don Berwick's report was commissioned by ministers, led by Lord Darcy, with the support of David Nicholson, to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the NHS. And let me tell you what it actually said. The NHS has developed a widespread culture more of fear and compliance. It is not uncommon for managers and clinicians to hit the target and miss the point. It highlighted the inadequacy of quality control mechanisms in the NHS. Priorities that are emphasised by these assessments are seen as being motivated by political rather than health concerns. It also highlighted the anger felt by many conscientious medics at government changes to their employment and being pressurised to put targets ahead of patients. The GP and consultant contracts are deprofessionalising. Far too many managers and policy leaders in the NHS are incompetent, unethical, or worse. The report warns this must be alleviated if improvement is to move forward more rapidly over the next 5 to 10 years. But these warnings were ignored, and we know that the improvements never happened. Its damning conclusion of a decade of healthcare reform is that the sort of aim implied by Lord Darcy's vision is not likely to be realised by the 1998 to 2008 methods. And his report was not alone. Let me reveal what the other 2 reports also have to say. A pervasive culture of fear in the NHS and certain elements of the Department of Health. The Department of Health's current quality oversight mechanisms have certain significant flaws. And perhaps the most damning indictment of all, that the politicians are responsible. The culture appears to be embedded in and expanded upon by the new regulatory legislation now in the House of Commons. But instead of being acted on with urgency, this was all buried. We only know of the existence of Don Berwick's and the other reports because a medic was so concerned that the Berwick's warnings and solutions had been buried that he tipped off a think tank, Policy Exchange, who had to use a Freedom of Information request to bring them to public light in 2010, 2 years later. They were not even available to the Health Select Committee. Now let's get one thing clear. The NHS is a huge, monolithic organisation with an exceptionally difficult and some might say almost impossible task. In reality, it is true that sometimes things will go wrong, sometimes very wrong. The crime is not so much that things were going wrong, bad as that is. It is that instead of the focus being immediately to tackle it, the priority was to cover up an awful truth that was uncomfortable for ministers and chief executives. Dispatch box appearance all too often mattered more than reality of patient lives, leaving whistleblowers and patient groups like Julie Bailey, who was disgracefully dismissed by David Nicholson as a lobby group, screaming into a vacuum, often at great personal cost. That is the crime, the smothering of the truth, which cost lives, the deadly silence. And what was the cost of suppressing this Don Berwick's urgent prescription for the NHS? Well, the clinical director of NHS Scotland recently suggested that in following Don Berwick's recommendations, they have seen an estimated 8,500 fewer deaths since January 2008. So we may well ask, what was the cost in lives for our NHS by the last government's decision to bury this truth? We know that across the 14 trusts now being investigated plus mid-staffs, there were 2,800 excess deaths between the time Don Berwick's report and others were presented to ministers and their final revelation in 2010. If the last government had urgently been implementing the recommendations of Don Berwick for the last 5 years, who knows how many of these lives might have been saved? So how was this allowed to happen? I have put down Freedom of Information requests asking what meetings took place to discuss these reports and who was present. Although David Nicholson was working closely with Lord Darcy on the next stage review, he said in front of the Health Select Committee that incredibly he knew nothing about these reports. This was the Health Select Committee, so we must take him at his word. But the question then remains then, who did read and suppress these vital reports? Was it ministers? Was it officials? And if officials, how was this allowed to happen? If the Department of Health is to move away from a culture of cover-up, I do expect a full and accurate response to my request to know who was responsible and would ask the Secretary of State to assist me in that. Now, former ministers and the former government opposite, as they already have done, will complacently say that these reports fed into Lord Darcy's next stage review and informed the higher quality for care for all report. I asked the House whether a document that starts with the then Secretary of State, the member for Hull, West and Hessel, beamingly saying, on its 60th anniversary, the NHS is in good health, reflects the content of the reports we have just heard. It certainly does not. Indeed, whilst the Department of Health claims that it drew heavily on the 3 reports in putting together high-quality care for all, a source close to the authorship of those very reports said that they found this claim, and I quote, to be disingenuous at best. In fact, David Florey, the Deputy Chief Executive of the NHS, later told the Francis inquiry that he had at least some responsibility for what happened to the reports, as he had actually read them, but insisted they were caricatures. That would help explain why they were not acted upon, but it does make the Department for Health's and the Honourable Member's insistence that they drew heavily on them rather odd. Further indication that these documents were not acted upon is the fact that the issues that they raise are almost identical to the issues highlighted 5 years later in the Francis report. If I may, and finally, if Don Berwick's warnings had been acted upon 5 years ago, there'd be no need to ask Don Berwick back now to step in to sort things out and implement his recommendations. I gladly give way to the member.
I wonder if the honourable member is coming round to the point that Francis AQC, in a 2-year public inquiry, looking at producing 2 volumes, looked at all these documents and said that many of the issues in there had obviously been acted upon. Rather than Darcy, rather than Francis drawing the conclusions that she is concluding, over a 2-year review, he drew completely the opposite conclusion.
There are some various elements of the Francis report that I find rather strange, not least one that the current Chief Executive, David Nicholson, is minuted as dismissing patient concerns of Julie Bailey as simply lobbying as opposed to widespread concern, and that this minute was dismissed in evidence, contrary to a non-recollection from David Nicholson that he couldn't recall ever having said something like that, and that he thought that he wouldn't possibly have done. So I have to say, I think the fact that we're asking Don Berwick back 5 years after he initially gave recommendations to the members opposite speaks far louder than a few sentences in the Francis inquiry which people may beg to differ with. But I will not be distracted by the honourable member. I will go back to my point. I'm also about to reveal how crucial mortality data, which Harvard University said should have triggered an aggressive investigation, was ignored. And when it became too prevalent to ignore, it was, like so many whistleblowers, discredited. David